Last month, a case report was published describing an 80-year-old Japanese woman with advanced Alzheimer's disease. Now, if you've ever watched someone go through Alzheimer's, you'll know how devastating it is. It's often described as grieving someone before they've actually gone, and over the course of 10 years, this woman had gradually lost everything that made her who she was. For the previous 5 years, she'd spoken almost entirely in single words, she couldn't dress herself, she'd been incontinent for years, she needed help walking, and most of the time she showed very little emotion. By any clinical standard, she had advanced Alzheimer's disease. And then she was given 5 grams of psilocybin mushrooms. Now, the first part of that experience sounded pretty rough. She became agitated, she started sweating heavily, and the researchers suspected she had developed a fever. Eventually, she entered what they described as a prolonged sleep state that lasted about 19 hours. Now, imagine her family. An 80-year-old relative with advanced dementia has just taken a very large dose of psilocybin mushrooms, and now she's lying there apparently unconscious for the best part of a day. I can only imagine what was going through their heads. But then she woke up, and she started talking and having proper conversations. She started recounting stories from her life, recognising her family members. She was laughing and even cracked a few jokes. And over the following few days, she began dressing herself, she regained urinary continence after more than 5 years, she made eye contact, became more expressive, and even described a dream where she was surfing with her son on a peaceful island. Reading the paper, I kept thinking about what it must have been like for her family. Imagine believing that you've lost someone, and then for a few weeks they're suddenly back. Now, before this goes any further, I want to keep this firmly grounded. It wasn't a clinical trial, it wasn't a controlled experiment, it was one patient, there were no brain scans before or after, no standardised cognitive testing, and the authors are very careful about that, and so am I. Nothing in this paper shows that psilocybin treats or cures Alzheimer's. Marcus Largo, the lead author, has also warned families not to take this as encouragement to give mushrooms to relatives with dementia. This woman experienced an extremely intense physiological response, and there are genuine risks for this population. So why am I making an entire video about one case report? Because I couldn't stop thinking about one question. Where did those memories come from? If Alzheimer's destroys the neurons that store memories, how do those memories suddenly become available again? Where did the stories come from? Where did the jokes come from? Where did that version of her go for the last 5 years? So I started looking into Alzheimer's research, expecting to find an explanation. But instead, I found unanswered questions. It turns out doctors have been seeing moments like this for decades. They even have a name for them: paradoxical lucidity. It's a strange name for an even stranger phenomenon. Doctors have been reporting it for decades. Someone with severe dementia, sometimes after barely speaking for years, will suddenly become completely lucid. They start recognising their children, start asking meaningful questions and telling stories. Some apologise for things that happened years ago. Some ask for specific people, and some even start making jokes. And then, often just as suddenly as it arrived, it's gone again. Sometimes it lasts a few minutes, sometimes a few hours, very occasionally longer. Now, a lot of these episodes happen in the days or hours before death, which is partly why they haven't received as much attention as they probably deserve. Families are understandably focused on saying goodbye, not documenting what they're seeing. But enough cases have accumulated that researchers eventually started asking whether this was actually a real phenomenon. And it was. In 2024, researchers reviewed everything they knew about paradoxical lucidity and arrived at a fairly uncomfortable conclusion. If our common understanding of dementia is correct and cognitive function can genuinely be erased, then none of this should happen. It shouldn't be possible. Now think about that for a second. If the neurons were physically gone, where did the memories come from? If the language centres have been destroyed, how could they be speaking? The existence of paradoxical lucidity doesn't prove that Alzheimer's is reversible or that dementia is somehow all in the mind, but what it does suggest is that our model is wrong, or at least incomplete. Maybe there are periods during Alzheimer's where the machinery is still there, but something is preventing it from working properly. That idea kept popping up everywhere I looked, and this ties in with a completely different field of research that's fascinated me for a while, which is brain metabolism. For decades, Alzheimer's has largely been framed as a disease of plaques and tangles. Amyloid plaques build up outside neurons, tau tangles accumulate inside them. Eventually neurons die and functions like memory, language, and physical coordination disappear. It's the story most of us have heard our entire lives, but the problem is it doesn't explain everything. For one thing, people often die with large amounts of amyloid in their brains, but they never develop dementia. Others have relatively little amyloid and yet have severe symptoms. And despite billions of pounds spent developing drugs that remove amyloid, the clinical results have been At best, underwhelming. Now that doesn't necessarily mean amyloid isn't involved. It almost certainly is. The question is whether it's the thing driving the disease, or whether it's just another consequence of something going wrong much earlier. And this is where the metabolic theory of brain disease comes in. Researchers like Dale Bredesen, Stephen Cunan, and Suzanne Kraft have been arguing for years that Alzheimer's may be better understood as an energy problem. The first thing to fail isn't necessarily the neuron, it's the neuron's ability to power itself. So years before significant brain shrinkage appears, years before large numbers of neurons die, PET scans show something else. The brain starts using less glucose. It has less fuel and less energy. The neurons are still there, but they're just not working as well. Imagine your phone battery drops to 2%. So the phone isn't broken, but everything slows down. It freezes, apps crash, but you wouldn't assume that the hardware has actually disappeared. The apps are still there, it just doesn't have the power so that you can use them. It needs charging, and researchers are seeing something surprisingly similar in Alzheimer's. As glucose metabolism fails, communication between neurons becomes less reliable. Large brain networks stop coordinating properly, and memories become harder to access. It's only much later that many of those cells actually die. And that sequence is so important for understanding this disease. Dead neurons and severe symptoms are the tip of the iceberg. Dysfunctional energy uptake, transformation, and usage is the bulk of the issue that starts years before. Now, one study really caught my attention. Researchers found that a person's day-to-day cognitive function matched brain metabolism, so how efficiently it uses energy, far more closely than it matched structural brain damage. Put simply, people weren't functioning according to how much their brain had shrunk or been damaged. They were functioning according to how much energy different brain regions were able to produce. And that is a completely different way of looking at Alzheimer's. It also reminded me of something neurologists have known for a long time. After a stroke, areas of the brain that haven't actually been damaged often stop working because they've temporarily lost communications with other parts of the network. And weeks later, some of those same regions come back online. So it's not that the tissue has disappeared or died or been damaged, it's that the network was disrupted. Neurologists call this diascasis. It's a different disease, but it's the same principle. So loss of function isn't always the same thing as loss of tissue. I kept coming back to that idea because even if that's partly true in Alzheimer's, then the woman from the case report starts to make a little more sense. It suggests that the mushrooms didn't regrow her brain, but they may have temporarily helped dormant networks communicate again. Now that's still speculative. Nobody knows if that's what actually happened, but it's a hypothesis that's becoming much easier to take seriously once you stop thinking of Alzheimer's as a disease where everything simply disappears. And the more I read, the more it feels like it's not a case of whether the memories are gone, it's whether the brain can still reach them. So if Alzheimer's is, at least in part, an energy problem, where does psilocybin fit into all of this? This is where I think a lot of people get the wrong impression. Most people hear the word psilocybin and they immediately think about consciousness, hallucinations, crazy mystical experiences, ego dissolution, and all that jazz. And to be honest, that's understandable because they're the effects that most people actually experience and they're the ones that are most talked about. But underneath all of that, psilocybin is doing something just as interesting. It's changing the way brain cells communicate with each other. When psilocybin is converted into psilocin in the body, it activates something called the 5-HT2A receptor, a subtype of serotonin receptor. When this happens, brain networks that normally communicate in fairly predictable ways suddenly become much more flexible. Researchers often talk about increased plasticity, but flexibility is another useful way of describing it. So imagine you've got into a town where the main road is closed, which is forcing everyone to squeeze through the same tiny side streets. Traffic backs up, and nobody gets anywhere fast. But then, someone opens a whole new load of roads that had been closed for years, allowing cars to start finding new routes, and allowing people to easily move around town much more freely again. So that's a reasonable way of thinking about what psychedelics appear to do to large-scale brain networks. They're changing how different parts of the brain connect and communicate. We've actually seen this on brain scans. Rather than activity staying trapped inside the same familiar networks, communication becomes much more global. Parts of the brain that don't usually exchange much information suddenly begin interacting. For someone with depression, that can help loosen rigid patterns of thinking. For someone undergoing psychotherapy, it may help them see old problems from a different perspective. And for Alzheimer's, that's when things become particularly interesting. If some networks are structurally intact but struggling to communicate because they're metabolically compromised, could temporarily increasing communication help those networks function again? Nobody knows, but it's a plausible question, and that's all science ever starts with, a plausible question. There's something else that's caught my attention over the last couple of years. The more we study psychedelics, the less they seem to be acting only at the level of psychology or the mind. They're also affecting cell biology. For example, one study published earlier this year found that psilocybin appeared to stimulate remyelination in rats. Myelin is the fatty insulation wrapper around nerve fibers in the brain. You can think of it like plastic coating around electrical wires, and without that insulation, signals leak, they slow down and generally just become unreliable. So healthy myelin allows brain regions to communicate with remarkable precision. What's interesting is that myelin is one of the first things to suffer when brain metabolism starts failing. The cells responsible for maintaining it are incredibly energy hungry, so when the energy becomes scarce, myelin maintenance starts slipping too. Another study from last year looked even deeper. Instead of focusing on networks, it looked inside individual cells. Researchers found that psilocin extended the lifespan of human cells grown in the laboratory by somewhere between 30 and almost 60%, depending on the conditions. And when they gave aged mice psilocybin once a month, those mice survived considerably longer than untreated animals. Now, those weren't Alzheimer's mice, and mice aren't humans, but what interested me wasn't necessarily the lifespan extension, it was the mechanism. Researchers saw improvements in pathways involved in mitochondrial function, reduced oxidative stress, higher activity of genes involved in cellular repair, exactly the kind of systems that people studying Alzheimer's metabolism have been talking about for years. Again, this doesn't prove that psilocybin treats Alzheimer's, but it does suggest that psilocybin may be doing something far more than temporarily changing conscious experience. It appears to influence some of the machinery that keeps cells healthy in the first place. Then I started thinking back to the woman in the case report. Her amyloid plaques almost certainly didn't disappear overnight. Her tau tangles didn't suddenly unravel. It's highly unlikely that 10 years of neurodegeneration was simply reversed while she slept. Whatever happened, it happened much faster than structural repair could possibly occur. So perhaps that's the wrong place to look. If you've ever jump-started a car with a flat battery, you'll know that the engine hasn't been repaired. You've simply provided enough energy for the system to begin working again. Eventually, if the battery isn't replaced, the problem comes back. And that's exactly what happened here. The improvements gradually faded. But in many ways, that might be the most important part of the entire story. If this had been a permanent recovery, I'd honestly be much more skeptical. The temporary nature of the improvement actually fits surprisingly well with the metabolic model. For a few weeks, communication improved, function improved, and then the underlying disease continued. It came back. Which brings us to a much bigger question. If metabolism really sits this close to the centre of Alzheimer's, should we be thinking about treatment completely differently? Instead of asking how to reduce plaques and tau tangles, maybe we should be asking how to create the conditions that allow neurons to keep functioning properly for as long as possible. Because if the brain is struggling to produce energy, that opens the door to a whole new range of interventions. Things like sleep, exercise, blood sugar control, ketogenic therapies, reducing chronic inflammation, supporting mitochondrial function, and perhaps one day psychedelics like psilocybin, not as a miracle cure, but as one piece of a much larger puzzle. I think that's a far more interesting direction than asking whether magic mushrooms cure Alzheimer's. I don't think they do, but I think they may help us ask better questions about what neurodegenerative disease actually is, and how best we can firstly prevent it, and then potentially treat it. The more I read about Alzheimer's, the less I find myself thinking about mushrooms. I find myself thinking about metabolism. Now that might sound strange after spending 20 minutes talking about psilocybin, but I actually think that's the more important story here. Because if the metabolic theory is broadly correct, then Alzheimer's doesn't suddenly begin the day someone forgets where they left their keys or how to make a cup of tea. It begins years earlier, possibly even decades earlier. Long before obvious symptoms occur, the brain slowly becomes less able to produce and use energy, and brain communication starts breaking down. Networks become less efficient. Eventually, the symptoms increase and become impossible to ignore. Now, that's a very different way of looking at the disease. It also changes the kind of questions that we should be asking. Instead of asking, how can we reduce amyloid plaques, we might ask, how do they build up in the first place? Instead of asking, how do we regenerate dead neurons, we might ask, how do we keep vulnerable neurons functioning before they actually die? These questions represent a new perspective on Alzheimer's, and they tend to lead researchers towards different solutions. People like Dale Bredesen have been arguing for years that Alzheimer's isn't caused by one thing. It's the result of lots of small failures happening together. Insulin resistance, poor sleep, chronic inflammation, oxidative stress, nutrient deficiencies, hormonal changes, loss of movement, loss of metabolic flexibility. Each one nudges the brain a little further away from the conditions it needs to thrive. You can argue about the details, scientists certainly do, but the general direction of travel seems pretty clear. The brain isn't separate from the rest of the body. It obeys the same biological rules as every other organ. It needs energy, oxygen, it needs healthy blood vessels, it needs functioning mitochondria, and when those things begin to fail, the brain begins to fail with them. One study that really fascinated me was published earlier this year on something called superagers. These are people in their 80s who still have memory performance more typical of someone decades younger. Researchers looked at their brains and found one of the biggest differences between them and regular agers was that their brains maintained the ability to generate new neurons in the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is one of the first regions affected in Alzheimer's. In other words, healthy aging appears to be about preserving the brain's ability to repair and adapt throughout life. That idea feels surprisingly consistent with everything I've learned and everything we've talked about today. Plasticity, energy, adaptation, resilience. And that's where I think psilocybin becomes profoundly valuable. Again, not because I think it's the single answer, but because it seems to sit right at the intersection of many of these processes. Neuroplasticity, inflammation, mitochondrial signaling, remyelination, large-scale brain networks. Whether it ultimately becomes an established Alzheimer's treatment, I have absolutely no idea, but I do think it has massive potential, and it's already done something incredibly valuable in that it's forced researchers to ask better questions. Sometimes science advances because of a huge clinical trial involving thousands of people, sometimes it advances because of one observation doesn't fit the existing model. And the case of an 80-year-old dementia patient taking 5 grams of psilocybin mushrooms and regaining lucidity and functions that science assumed were lost forever seems like one of those paradigm-shifting observations. Maybe many years from now, this case report will turn out to be the moment that researchers started thinking differently about Alzheimer's. We'll just have to wait and see. But either way, I think there's a lesson here that goes way beyond dementia. We often think of disease as something that suddenly appears. One day you're healthy, and the next day you're ill. But biology doesn't really work like that. Most chronic diseases develop slowly. It's the body compensating, adapting, and finding workarounds, until eventually it can't anymore. Symptoms are often the point where compensation fails, not the point where the disease begins. I think that's one of the biggest lessons that modern neuroscience is teaching us. The absence of symptoms doesn't always mean the absence of pathology, and the presence of symptoms doesn't necessarily tell us exactly what's gone wrong. There's usually much more happening beneath the surface. And that's one of the reasons I find the brain so endlessly fascinating. Just when you think you've got it all figured out, it surprises you. If you enjoyed this video, you'll probably enjoy my others, so I'll see you in another one. Peace.